Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another interview on applied virtue. Today, I have a very special guest, um, Adam. You've gone by both Adam Katz and Dennis Bouvard. Which do you prefer?
Oh, you can call me Adam. That's my real name. The Bouvard is a pseudonym for the book, and now my Substack.
Oh, okay, okay. I mean, I called you Bouvard because that's the what's on your book and on the blog that I read on the
Yeah,
subject.
sure.
Uh, but yeah, there are would you like to introduce yourself, Adam?
Okay. You know, I'm the author of Anthropomorphics, which is a book that followed up on some years of blogging that I was doing. That's based on what's called the originary hypothesis, and what we also refer to as GA, generative anthropology, which is a hypothesis regarding the origin of language, which is also the origin of the human and the origin of the sacred and everything and everything associated with that. And so that was discovered by Eric Gans, who's a now a retired French professor at UCLA, and he's been studying this and arguing for it for now over 40 years. And I came into it about now about 20 years ago, um, and I've been following what seemed to me the implications of GA, of the originary hypothesis, and I got to a point, I guess, around 2015, 2016, when I started to take it in directions that were a bit different than the ones that Gans was interested in, and I started to get interested in what now is often called post-liberal political thinking, and figuring out how to think the originary hypothesis in those terms. But I guess I'll leave it at that. I guess that's an introduction.
I have to say, when I first came across your work and GA in particular, I was immediately struck by it. It was definitely unlike most of the things that I'd come across up till that point. I actually the first article that I read from you was on your GA blog. It was entitled "Sovereign as Onomastician in Chief." Do you remember that particular one or no?
Well, I remember it. To remember, I'm sure you'll be able to refer to things in it that I don't quite remember, but I know what you're referring to.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, what struck me was the critique of individualism and the critique of individualism you made was that it was inherently psychopathic and also a kind of negative Gnostic theology. Those were some very strong words, but but you were able to lay out the case that individualism by saying, "Oh, I'm going to don't refer to me as an X, refer to me as an individual or whatever unique signifier." You're the individualist is basically trying to divorce himself from any outward sociality. And this coincided with a lot of what I've been reading because I'm an Aristotelian Thomist. And the way Thomists tend to tackle individualism is they tend to look at it as a denial of human sociality. We follow Aristotle's view that humans are social rational animals, and that there is this inherent sociality in us that is natural to us, and to flourish as humans requires us to be living in a society. But the most primitive being the family, and then moving on up to political society and religious society in the church. Um, and liberalism is basically a denial of that, You see this with Thomas Hobbes and his war of all against all in the state of nature, Rousseau with his idea of the state of nature, and to a lesser extent, modern liberal theories too, like libertarianism and progressivism. And you, in your particular critique, um, sort of meshed well with that. In fact, I think I remember in one of your recent Substacks, you cited Aristotle as in defense of the idea of mimetic desire, which, by the way, mimetic desire is also something I've incorporated into my videos and my work as a very useful concept. So maybe you could, I guess I've kind of uh, said a lot without asking a question. I guess my what I'd like to know is what in case the in your own words, what would the your critique of individualism be, and how does it relate to GA and mimetic desire?
Okay, yeah, that laid out a lot, and I'll try and address as much of that as I can. There'd be, I'd get at some of those things differently. Yes, Aristotle is one of the is kind of an early reference to presenting human beings as especially mimetic, as a way of distinguishing them from animals, and that's kind of been a kind of, let's say, a commonplace of mimetic thinking for as long as there's been mimetic thinking, I suppose. But individualism, yeah, in a sense, the one origin of individualism, I think, uh, is something that is actually part of civilization, and that we would want to maintain. And individualism, in a sense, kind of let's say, substantializes something that really shouldn't be substantialized, and that's that's the more juridical idea that in order to condemn someone, you need to have a kind of process. You need to you need to have some way of seeking out the facts, the motivations, and so on, that go into a person's actions, and that go into determining whether the person has actually done what they're accused of. And this is really, a way of that was a long historical process, and I think is intrinsic to civilization, of replacing processes like scapegoating, which is very closely tied to mimetic desire, especially in Rene Girard's thinking, and the vendetta, right, which organizes violence around avenging crimes and offenses committed by one group against another. Now, the way of distancing a community from those kinds of practices, which lead to uncontrolled violence at a certain point, is to establish some kind of institution that, in a certain sense, begins by suspending judgment on a particular individual, so that you can then inquire into what that individual has done, who says this individual has done it, what indicates that the individual has done it or has not done it. If the individual has done it, why might they have done it? What were the circumstances of the doing, and so on. And if you're going to set up an institution that's going to ask all of those questions, then, in a certain sense, what you're doing is you're carving out a space to look at an individual, in a sense, free from anything that's not going to be helpful in determining whether that individual has done the thing that they're accused of doing. And so, in a sense, this provided an opening. This is, the individual here is not kind of pre-social, obviously. The individual, in the case that we're talking about, is very, embedded in a specific social order, just like any judicial process is very deeply embedded in a social order, and it's embedded in notions of trust and reliability, and whose word you're willing to take against whose other word, and so on. So obviously, it's a very deeply social process. But once you make this move of saying, okay, we're going to suspend certain things that we're familiar with about a particular individual, so that we could just zero in and see what these accusations against this individual amount to, instead of just piling on the accusations once they've started to be made, as a kind of mimetic crisis would lead us to do, right? This is a way of resisting a mimetic crisis when one person is in a sense pointed to, and someone else points to them, and then everybody starts pointing them, and that person becomes the center of attention, which very often is going to mean a center of violence. So, in a sense, these kinds of civilized juridical institutions are meant to suspend that process and prevent us from acting out in this way, right? Girard speaks about the lynch mob, right? Which itself might be a more complex kind of quasi institution than he says, but leaving that aside, insofar as you want to resist this process towards a rush towards scapegoating, you do have to, in a sense, kind of suspend and kind of frame and carve out a space to look at this individual in this case, separate from all these other things. Now, none of that means, I mean, then it's kind of a long process to get from that individual who's kind of, again, looked at in a certain way within a particular court system, particular legal system, and therefore a particular political system, and so on. It's a long way to get from there to saying, well, the whole social order is founded on this individual standing all by himself, right? And to get to liberalism, we'd have to trace out the series of steps that kept kind of carving out, more and more of a space. So again, instead of the individual being, again, a kind of a result of our suspending judgment because we're asking certain questions, once you then substantialize it and say, okay, this individual has certain things in himself that found him as an individual, that constitute him as an individual separate from anything else, well, then you've made this step into liberalism. So a lot of the resistance to liberalism and the countering of liberalism and the need ultimately really to replace liberalism as a way of thinking and as an institutional order has to be done in such a way that that these basic civilizational elements are not destroyed in the process as well. Okay, so that's one, that's getting at one point that you raised, there, this question of individualism, and but yes, once it's detached in that way, and the process by which this happens, I'm guessing you're familiar with Chris Bond's Nemesis.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
I've talked about that on my show before.
right. Well, I mean, that's a very helpful way of thinking about how this process of continually detaching the individual from any social order, from any social moorings, took place, and you get and ultimately you get to the point where, okay, so the king in a sense is creating individuals by bypassing these intermediate layers, right? The nobility and in some cases the church, and so on, and you create this individual relation between the individual and the sovereign, right? And then once you have that, well, first of all, it turns out you don't need the king anymore. Once you have that, any kind of sovereign can have this singular relationship with each individual, right? Each individual is related first of all to the state, right? And then all you have to do is kind of reverse that and say, well, there's a state because all these individuals came together and created the state. And in a kind of logical sense, you could see the move that's being made there, right? And you kind of cut out the history that put the individual in a kind of singular relation to the sovereign in the first place. And then that encourages, incentivizes a politics of continually leveraging the individual, either an individual victim of the state or victim of some other group, or all the individuals aggregated as the people, or the individual as a bearer of rights, and then the rights are the thing that you're defending against the sovereign. And so you can keep leveraging the individual as the constituent of the sovereign against the sovereign, right? And this becomes a politics, and it's a politics that ultimately involves, contesting for sovereignty itself, right? The goal is to become the sovereign who's leveraging the individual against the sovereign, and it's very paradoxical and it's very dysfunctional. But in a sense, that's what liberal politics ends up with. Okay, so that's that. So again, that's there's more to say about it. Of course, there'll always be more to say about it, but that's I guess that's the best way of responding to that part of it. Now, the where I would see things a little differently, I think, than either a Thomist or an Aristotelian is well, when you say rational individual, yeah, yes, in a sense, if we mean by rational something as basic as language using, um, and you can talk about rationality in a lot of ways, but the starting point for GA is going to be um, not so much society in general, not really, say the polis built on the family, right? Because this is a later development. We're going to start with a very kind of small community, grounded in ritual, right? The starting point is really ritual here, and I think ancient philosophy, Aristotle included, um, is really trying to kind of um, distance their community, their social order from being founded in ritual, which for them, for a philosopher, but also for a member of the polis, would have been seen at that point as a kind of irrational violence that civilization needs to rise above, and there's a point to that, but um, you as an anthropological matter, ritual comes before any philosophical category is going to come, and mimesis, which is the most basic level, imitation, the fact that we're all imitating each other, and that imitation leads to rivalry, right? That's the production of desire, right? That's mimetic desire. When you learn what to desire from seeing somebody else's desire, and if you learn what you desire from seeing somebody else's desire, then at a certain point, you're going to come into conflict with that person.
Mm.
And ritual is essentially, I mean, Girard sees this differently, and obviously, I follow the way Gans thinks about this. But in either case, what ritual does is it organizes these mimetic desiring beings around a common center, so that the violence that's implicit in mimetic desire and mimetic rivalry can be deferred. That's, of course, Gans's term. That language representation is the deferral of violence. And if we start from there, then we have a somewhat different historical trajectory, and we're going to have a different way of speaking about things like ethics and morality. But maybe I'll stop there and see if you want to follow up on some of that.
Yeah, sure. But the thing is, obviously, um, St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, though they're working within a similar framework, they're going to come to different conclusions. St. Thomas, for example, he's a saint. He was a medieval theologian. A, he wasn't. I guess I don't think either of them could be called rationalists in the modern sense, but definitely St. Thomas couldn't be considered a rationalist because of how central faith was to his ideas. The way St. Thomas and Aristotle would have talked about reason, though, first, both of them would have situated reason, rationality, within a tradition in a move very similar to MacIntyre.
Mhm.
In fact, MacIntyre's thought is Aristotelian Thomist in a lot of ways. So of course he's going to, that he's following somebody. But another thing that is this is something in Aristotelianism that I found worked with mimetic desire is rationality in according to Thomists is simply the human capacity for abstract reasoning. So I can look at whereas an animal can just make associations between different physical things, like they can associate danger something like a physical harm with a certain predator in a very animalistic way, a very instinctual way. Humans can abstract that and create. Uh, they can abstract certain concepts from the scene that they are in, and then apply them to other scenes and use the and string them together into sentences and order them logically. And that capacity does work with if you think about rationality that way, then a Thomist would say that this mimetic desire naturally would come from this rationality, because what is mimetic desire but simply being able to recognize that the other person has this intentionality, and drawing on that from that all these different conclusions, like you said, leading to this conflict. And in that can only be possible if you have a certain level of abstract reasoning. This individual has this capacity for abstract reasoning, which is what Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas would have said. What That's what reason consists of. Do you get what I mean?
Yes, I do. Again, I don't want to suggest any incompatibility, of course, between mimetic design, mimetic theory, and either Thomism or Aristotelian thought.
There's certainly a tension.
The part of the difference here, if I could pick up on what you just said, I suppose you could say that language itself involves an abstraction, because what language means is being able to refer to something that's not directly in front of you, that's not immediately causing any desire. And so if we could see a rational being in those terms, then there's there's a way of thinking these two, approaching these two modes of thought in a kind of dialogue with each other. But I would say let's talk about the content of thought, and again I would say well, two things. One, you're referring to the ability to form sentences as part of abstract rational thought. And in a sense, I would agree with that. But for GA, the first sign is not a sentence. And in fact, this is Ganz's critique of metaphysics, right? He says that metaphysics is the mode of thought that sees the declarative sentence as the primary linguistic form. And his argument is that the ostensive sign, which is a kind of naming, to go back to the reference to that to that blog post that you mentioned at the beginning of our talk. That's why I keep coming back to naming as so central, because naming is essentially an ostensive sign, right? An ostensive sign is meaningful in the presence of more than one person who can recognize the object pointed to by the sign, and can respond to the sign, and can use the sign in the presence of the object. And so this is, in a sense, pre-reason or pre-rational, at least according to most definitions I can imagine. And after the ostensive, you then have the imperative, because the imperative is really, in a sense, again in Ganz's analysis in The Origin of Language, which is really quite a remarkable book. Where he traces the emergence. Again, it's hypothetical, but it's very kind of it's very rationally worked out. The imperative follows from the ostensive, because the imperative is starts off as an inappropriate ostensive. Now, I don't want to get too much into the details of this, but then the declarative is a result of certain problems that arise with the imperative. So the declarative is really the latest, the most mature speech form to emerge. And so if we can talk about if the ostensive and if the imperative meet a definition of rational, which I imagine they could, I don't know, then we'd be on the same page, so to speak. But what's a little bit more important, I think, here is to get at what we could call, I guess, the content of thought, right? And the reason why I keep coming back to ritual is that the first content of thought, and I think the first sentences and the first discourses would be concerning ritual, because ritual is really you're doing something that that the divine being or the sacred being, whatever it might be, in the case of that community, is telling you to do, and you're doing that, and part of you doing that is making some kind of request in return on the part of the divine being. So the most basic kind of relationship is everyone in the community bringing a piece of their of the kill back to the center, and kind of sacrificing that in the ritual, and in exchange, the divine being, which again for the earliest communities might be the deer, that the spirit of the deer that the group depends upon for its survival. In return, the divine being is going to provide you with more deer, and sometimes it doesn't work. Right. Sometimes you carry out the ritual in the way that it's been prescribed, and nevertheless the deer don't show up when you need them, and then you need to account for that, because you don't have a way of thinking about why there might be deer or not deer outside of the deer god providing you with more of himself, essentially. Right. That's kind of your deal, your exchange with the deity. And so you have to you have to come up with a narrative to understand why the deer aren't showing up. You did something wrong. Did you offended the god in some way? Maybe some member of the community was kind of somehow misapplied, their part in the ritual, or something along those lines. And this is where I think thinking begins. It begins by trying to figure out why a ritual doesn't work. And so my way of thinking about this, and my way of extending this forward, is to say that this is really still always the case, that all of our thinking is an attempt trying to understand why the exchanges we're involved with with the central being, whatever that counts as. It might count as the government. It might count as the technosphere, or something along those lines. This obviously becomes a much more challenging question in the contemporary world, where there's not a ritual center anymore that everyone goes to and everyone recognizes. But whatever that might be, I think our thinking is still always organized around trying to figure out what went wrong, what ritual did we carry out in an improper way, which of our habits are getting in the way of receiving the favor of the central being, whatever that might be. Which is to say, we still haven't really gotten outside of what's essentially prayer, because that's what we're talking about. I mean, prayer is where you're kind of negotiating, in a sense, with God, or with whatever the deity of the particular community is. And so I'm trying to kind of rethink what thinking is, in a sense, around this. And once, having said that, I wouldn't deny that there are all kinds of convergences with Aristotelian Thomas thought and others, and there'll be a dialogue along these lines. And certainly, in a lot of ways, what I'm arguing for, I think, would ultimately be closer to what you're talking about than either of us would be to a kind of liberal rationalism, where the assumption is that the individual, in a kind of Cartesian manner, can just eliminate all doubt and just function according to sheer calculation, or something along those lines. Obviously, we're both rejecting that, but the distinctiveness of GA, of the originary hypothesis, which I'm trying to preserve, and what I think accounts for what's kind of new about it, is this kind of rerouting of our thinking about thinking back to things like ritual and myth and prayer and so on, and to insist that we're still always bound up in this kind of relationship that we can never make fully explicit, right? There's always this tacit dimension to it that we're always explicating as we go along, and that's rationality. I mean, rationality is really explicating what's been implicit, what's been tacit in our previous engagements with the center. And so in a certain sense, you can't really step outside of that. And that's really the critique of things like individuality and rationality. Okay, so I'll stop there and give you a
Yeah,
chance to.
yeah. Like I said before, certainly Aristotelian Thomism sees rationality as being bound up with tradition, and
Mhm.
you can, and in a sense, you could call that tradition pre-rational in that in the sense, if you mean by pre-rational, that means what we have to assume before we start using these declarative statements. Uh, what we would say though is that if you mean by rationality the ability to conceptualize and then eventually and use conceptualize and then create all these create what we would call language, um, then that comes before even the ostensive in a way, because you wouldn't be able to have mimetic desire or language that comes out of that through deferral without first having this, I think one philosopher called it root capacity, but essentially it's an active what Thomists would call an active potency. It's a power, basically. This power that's natural to humans to be able to do this, that is that activates in this situation, because animals, when they get into this situation, they would not be able to do things like this. That in fact, you could from my reading of GA, I don't think animals would get into the situation where there's this mimetic desire and this crisis that emerges from it. There needs to be first that root capacity, that power, before this situation comes about. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. There may be a difference here. Let me respond to that and see what and see what you think.
Okay.
Um, yeah, the for GA and here Gans is really following Girard. Mimetic desire and the mimetic rivalry and crisis is really seen as the sort of transition point between animal and human, and so imitation is not intrinsically human, right? Animals don't really imitate each other nearly as much as it may look like they imitate each other, right? You see animals, like a flock of birds. One bird kind of takes off, and all the others follow, and it kind of looks like they're imitating each other. That's not really what's going on, and it's really only the more the more intelligent, more advanced, I guess we'd have to say, animals that really imitate each other. And let's kind of stick to the primates in this case, and the chimpanzees and apes and so on. They imitate each other, again, not the way in which humans do. There's kind of a fundamental difference here, but they do imitate each other, and our hypothesis is that a particularly imitative breed of primates, what for want of a better word, Gans will refer to as proto-humans, reached a certain threshold of imitative capacity that made the mimetic crisis possible. So the question is whether what you're calling reason is necessary for that level of imitation that would, in a sense, trigger mimetic desire and rivalry and crisis. And my inclination is to say no, that you can imitate without reason, right? You can You could stick very close to what someone else is doing, and someone raises their hand, and you could raise their hand. You can raise your hand in response, and that doesn't necessarily require any reason. Again, unless we're defining reason in a very different way than usual. I think so we can narrow down the question to that. I think what's involved in imitation, what's required, what do we have to assume about a being that's capable of imitating other members of the same species to such an extent that they could come into violence over their shared desire for a single object. And Gans always tries, and I've followed in this as well, because it's otherwise you end up cluttering things up in a way that becomes unhelpful. Try and keep things as minimal as possible, and to say, okay, there must have been a being that a species, however we want to talk about it, that was capable of imitating other members of the same species to this extent, because there's no other way of accounting for the origin of language and of humanity. But we're not in a position. Ultimately, this becomes a different kind of question. It becomes a biological question. Maybe it becomes a question of ethology, and animal behavior. This kind of thing that GA is not going to claim any expertise in, and is not going to make any assertions about. So and we don't, and I don't find it necessary to make that kind of assumption, beyond there must have been beings capable of this level of imitative activity. Which in a sense means, I guess, that I wouldn't necessarily want to argue against someone who does posit something. I would just say it's not necessary for the originary hypothesis.
All right, yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, if you're coming at it from a different perspective, the idea in the idea is that the originary hypothesis, as you and Gans describe, is more of speculation and heuristic than an actual "this is a theory, we know what happened" type of deal, as far as I can read into it. So
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hypothesis. Yes,
mhm.
that's and Gantz has always spoken about it as a hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis that could never be confirmed or refuted, or falsified, if we want to use the Popperian terminology. We'll never have the kind of whatever archaeological, whatever evidence we would be looking for, anthropological evidence that we would be looking for. I don't think we'd even know what to look for in order to confirm or refute the hypothesis. And It's the question, in a sense, is real because it's partly a question of what language is, and what that does mean is, you could, and there are people who are working with GA who have kind of, in a sense, distanced themselves or been agnostic over this being an actual event that must have happened. Something that fits the basic parameters of this event must actually have happened. So it is possible to work with GA, and it is possible to follow, the implications and benefit from following the implications of the originary hypothesis without, with that kind of agnosticism regarding the actual event. My own position is not that, though. I do insist that something along these lines had to have happened. And if you like, you can say this is a kind of faith on my part. I wouldn't quite describe it that way, but I'm not sure that I have much better ways of describing it either. So I wouldn't contest it too vigorously either. But I would insist that your thinking within GA and in terms of the originary hypothesis, I think it's going to be stronger without the agnosticism than it will be with the agnosticism. With the agnosticism, maybe it happened, but it doesn't really matter. It's kind of an interesting way to think about things. I think you end up with, sort of an interesting trend within literary criticism and cultural criticism and that kind of thing, which is what a lot of people interested in GA are mostly focused on. But I think to if you want to do some real political, social, civilization level thinking within GA, then I think you have to reject the agnosticism, the skepticism, and you have to kind of go all in and assume that yes, something like this did happen. It happened factually, materially. That there were this group of primates of proto-humans who aligned themselves around the center through a sign, through a gesture, that they all imitated and that they all understood, whatever we mean by the word understand under these conditions, to mean that they were not going to advance further on the central object, and that they then proceed to divide it in a, let's say, roughly equal way, in a way at least that includes all members of the group. And this creates a new mode of distribution that fundamentally distinguishes humans from animals as well. No more pecking order, but a what will be, you can't quite call the original scene ritual yet. Ritual, what you would see as ritual from the perspective of GA is essentially repetitions of the originary scene, right? It worked, and we keep doing it even now, even if we don't call it ritual now. It worked, and we keep doing it because it worked. And when it doesn't work so well, then we revise it and we refine it and we add dimensions to it, and we surround it with discourses that account for why it works and why it doesn't work and so on. But we're still ultimately in that, that's the tradition, right? The ultimate tradition for GA, that we're all ultimately still repeating the originary scene, and to think in those terms, then I think you have to believe in kind of a fully bodied, fully fleshed out scene, even if we're going to be very careful about what we want to describe in it or what we think we can describe in it.
Oh, definitely. I would agree with you that if you're going to have this theory of GA, you would need to have the starting point of the origin of language be an actual event. And this is sort of the criticism I have of certain liberal theories, like Thomas Hobbes's State of Nature, where Thomas Hobbes literally says in the Leviathan, "Hey, let's just pretend that humans are mushrooms that come from the ground fully formed." And I'm like, what? What? When did that happen? And the reason is, well, Thomas Hobbes doesn't literally believe this. He just thinks this is a useful way of thinking about society for whatever reason. But Hobbes, there's no if there's no reason to believe that humans literally came out of the ground fully formed like mushrooms, then why the heck are we thinking about society this way?
Right. Yes. And I think Gans from the very beginning was aware of, of the need to distinguish GA, the originary hypothesis, from myths of origin, and from also these kinds of either utopian or liberal state of nature, social contract type of projections, right? Hypotheses, or whatever these various thinkers would have called them, and which is why it's very it's very carefully grounded, and I must say for Girard as well, this was important. It's very carefully grounded in. Uh, well, in a sense, some notion of evolution. I mean, I don't know if you have to be a strict Darwinian to believe in GI. I don't think so. I mean, we don't even have to get into debates about different versions of evolution. But you would have to believe that that humans emerged from some other species, right? Some other, again, advanced primate species, and the way in which, say, apes will um, will divide some food is through a pecking order, and the alpha animal gets as much as he wants, and he eats until he's done, and then the beta comes along, and then gradually everyone gets their share. And this is basically the way in which animals divide up their food. And um, and humans don't really divide up their food that way. And certainly the earliest humans didn't. I mean, yes, I mean the stronger and the more dominant got found a way to get a bit more, and so on. But it didn't work like that. There is a kind of there's a distribution scene that that ensures that all the members of the community are kind of accounted for, in a sense. So how we get from one to the other, right? That's a very specific question, and it's a very difficult question to answer, I think, through the usual kind of Darwinian, genetic mutation that favors some behaviors over some other behaviors, and so on, and in a kind of long term. It's a very difficult way. It'd be very difficult to explain it that way, and this is part of the difficulty of GA and what's challenging about it. And I think what creates resistance to it, and as well, is the idea that humans were founded in an event actually runs counter to the way you're thinking about things if you're kind of a diehard evolutionist, right? Things don't work that way if you're kind of working within something akin to Darwinian evolution. And I guess if you're thinking in evolutionary terms, that's more or less the way you're thinking ultimately, in terms of these kind of gradual transformations as a result of these random mutations that again privilege certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of function, certain kinds of phenotypes over others, right? And so that could never be a single event that does that. A single event obviously can't be reduced to some kind of genetic transformation. And so by focusing things in this way, that in a sense it's both in conformity with a general sense of humans evolving out of other beings, but at the same time it runs directly counter to the way in which the way in which that's usually thought about. And if you read still about origins of humanity and origins of language, you'll still find articles all over the place that are trying to do this, to do these long term. Well, maybe this happened and maybe that happened, and this led to this genetic modification, and that led to that genetic modification, mutation or whatever, and then we can imagine that this, and they're all of course hypothetical as well, because they don't know either, right? And they kind of graph it out and chart it out and make it quantitative and so on. But it's still all just a very complicated guessing process, and they still really can't explain what exactly a human sign is, right? How is it that we can use a word and other people know, which is just a sound, right? First of all, and everybody knows what that sound is and how to put it together into sentences and so on,
Hmm.
which takes us way beyond any signaling and animal practices. How is that possible? And so part of the insistence on the origin of language as being an event is that that's the only way. There's no gradual kind of emergence of a sign, right? Either
Hmm.
it's a sign or it's not a sign, right? There's kind of there's kind of an event character of this that is close to what religions see as miracles. And this is but again, we account for that in terms of, again, this moment of crisis where there's a great danger to the existence, or at least a perceived great danger of existence, everyone else in the group from other members of the group itself. And that is what focused everybody's attention. Everybody's attention had to be focused in a fundamentally new way for the sign to emerge. And that had to happen in an event. You can't focus attention in some gradual, distributed, random way. Attention can only be focused in a specific event. So that's the way we're thinking about it. And I think this is what makes it really, the originary hypothesis is really incomparable to any of the other, again, state of nature, views, or myths of origin, or anything along those lines.
Yeah, the reason why I brought up that comparison with the originary hypothesis and something like Hobbes' state of nature and other things like that is because there was this article written in Imperium Press's Firstness Journal, the recent one. Have you seen the recent critique of generative anthropology by a guy named Aaron Hunter? Have you read that
Yes,
one?
yes, yeah. I've
He argues that there is this unfalsifiability into this theory, is is this is a result of Gonz's, and by extension your, lack of epistemic conscientiousness, and and he says, oh, this is a problem, since the theory itself, the framework, is sort of immune to evidence. You can't actually you can't actually ground the theory in anything real. Why it's basically on the same epistemic level as something like the Austrian school's Misesian praxeology, or even this one guy's conspiracy theory about UFOs.
Yeah, I'll point out that if you read that article, you never really get a description of what the originary hypothesis actually is. It's always kind of it's like he's working with a kind of checklist that an acceptably scientific theory has to have, and he's
Mm-hmm.
kind of going through this checklist, and he's seeing that GA doesn't check off these boxes, and so therefore it's not a scientific theory. And in a sense, it's not a scientific theory according to those criteria. And like I said before, it is unfalsifiable. But my answer to that is, first of all, you're going to take GA seriously, or you're going to be capable of taking GA seriously if you take the origin of language to be a serious question. Now, if you don't think the origin of language is a serious question, right? If you think, well, somewhere along the line, we kind of stumbled into saying certain things and other people repeated those arbitrary sounds that one person made, and somehow,
Somehow and it's somehow just we just so happen to ascribe assign meaning to these random arbitrary sounds that
yeah,
we have.
right. And we all somehow came to kind of know that that was the meaning of it, and to agree that that was the meaning of it, and so on. Or you can just say, I don't care, about it at all, and go about your way. I mean, in which case you might think it's a real question, but you think it's an unimportant question. If you think it's a real question, and you think it's an important question, and it's an important question because human beings are linguistic beings, are beings of language, right? This is what's fundamental to human beings, and language, even just as a matter of curiosity. I mean, the fact that we speak, that we use, words that by themselves are going to just sounds, that somehow have all these effects, and that we're able to follow up on them and combine them in all kinds of ways. I mean, if you're not curious about that, if you don't take that to be kind of an interesting question, then I'd wonder what you're curious about, in human terms altogether. So if you think it's a real question, and an important question, and how do you say anything about language if you can't say what language is? I mean, it's partly a claim about what language is in the first place. So if you think it's a real question, then you have to ask, well, what are some of the answers to the question? Language, there has to be an origin of language. There was a time, again, unless we're working with a strict, literal, creationist model, say from the book of Genesis, that said God, gave language to Adam. Then if you believe that, then obviously, these aren't questions for you, and a lot of other things won't be questions for you. And if that's an explanatory framework that you can work with, then that's fine. But if we set that aside, then there had to have been a time when there weren't speaking beings, when there wasn't language, when there weren't humans, and then there was a time when there was. To their credit, religions, including the authors of the book of Genesis and the authors of most, myths of most peoples, have been quite interested in these questions. Where did we come from? Because where did we come from is a large question of who we are. And if you're not interested in that, then what are you interested in exactly? So if you're taking this as a serious question, then you have to ask, well, what are the other answers? And this has always been Gant's approach. That here's my hypothesis. Yeah, I can't falsify. It can't be falsified. I can't prove it. But it's rigorous. It's got certain. It fulfills certain criteria. It accounts for what a sign is. It accounts for the way in which a community needs to be organized in such a way as to account for as to use signs. It accounts for the differentiation of humans from other species. It's predicated upon a quality of human beings that everyone has to acknowledge is very basic to human beings, which is that we're mimetic beings. That's kind of hard to deny that we're very basically, fundamentally mimetic beings. I mean, you have to watch a child for 3 minutes in order to realize that. So it's kind of it's a serious hypothesis that takes into account what we would have to assume and what we have to what we know about language in order to consider a serious hypothesis for the origin of language. So his approach, and it's one that I share, is to lay this out here, and if you got something better, what is it? And no one, no one has something better so far. And if they do, I'd be willing to entertain it, like I assume Gantz would be willing to entertain it. But no one has really come up with something serious. And that article certainly doesn't come up with something serious, something an alternative. And so my approach to that is, well, if this is the best hypothesis that we have, and maybe the best we can have, of the origin of language, again, this crucial, extremely interesting, extremely consequential question. If this is the best that we have, and I think it's the best by a long ways, why shouldn't we go with it? And if we go with it and we see where it leads and what its implications are, and we can test its power and its usefulness and so on, and either it'll prove itself in that way, or some better theory will emerge in the process that maybe will get us back to a better hypothesis. But by standing outside of it and saying, well, you can't test it in a laboratory and it doesn't meet this philosopher's criterion of a satisfactory theory and so on, that doesn't really contribute anything.
Yeah, that is true. I think that part of the problem I had with this and with that article is, in particular, he doesn't go over in great enough detail. It would have been one thing to for him to it would have been one thing for him to have said, okay, these are the this is what makes the theory false. Um, but it's another thing for him to go, well, this doesn't meet my personal definition of what a science is, what a philosophy is, and so on. And he just sort of says, well, religion and humanities, those are just going off the window. He throws the entire fields of study out the window on this basis, much which is very typical of how people who are in that kind of mindset act. They basically say, well, I can't prove it using this specific way. um, I think that the fact that generative anthropology is compatible with numerous parts of human experience that we can know outside of generative anthropology is a good enough reason to hold it at least as a heuristic hypothesis, and then make political statements based on that. And like you said, if you truly are open to something better, maybe there are more conversations to be had in the future with people in different religious traditions too. I think there are a lot of I think these kinds of scientific types, like a hunter, uh, they do, like you say, brush aside the question of origins and where we come from as unimportant. Or they just do this hand waving, oh, it was just gradual evolution, Darwinism. We don't have to go over it, you know, because they have this prejudice about it. They have this. you could say, reductionist prejudice, where they want to boil everything down to materialist atoms beating up against colliding into other atoms in a deterministic universe. And that's really what a lot of them want to boil everything down to. And that kind of materialist prejudice is um, something that has been animating liberalism for for about the past 100 years now. Certainly it was sort of implicit in it in Descartes, but it was given a greater expression in Hobbes, and then in especially in 19th and 20th century liberals like Karl Popper, who came up with this falsification standard. Um, I think that I don't think that it's guilty of this Mott and Bailey and bullshitting prejudice if you're able to point to things outside of GA that are compatible with the theory and are also open to other explanations of origin.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing I'll just, I think I said this, but I don't mind repeating it. If you read that article, just from reading that article, you wouldn't know what the originary hypothesis was. Um, and this seems to me really a basic question of scholarly ethics, probity, whatever, what propriety, whatever term we want to use to, if you're going to argue against if you're going to argue against a theory, then you, first of all, you present that theory in its own terms and in the strongest terms that you can. And that that very minimal obligation is never met there. And I think that if you do that, I think if you do really kind of invest in the originary hypothesis, at least to the extent of seeing what the reasoning behind it and what the logic of it is, and what kinds of questions it's answering and where those questions come from, and you really follow through on that, then I think it becomes difficult to be to dismiss it so blithely. It's a weighty thing if you're going to be willing to consider it. And yes, it's you're right that modern science and scientism and certain technologistic views of thinking in a sense reject origin and questions of origin. We can't really know what they are. They're not really important. The thing kind of functions in its own kind of according to its own internal constructed logic, whatever that might be. Human beings can't really do without the question of origin, and you see that all the time. Anytime we discuss something important, whether it's politics, whether it's ethics, whether it's an issue in a family, whatever it might be, you're going to find when you get into a serious discussion with someone, the question of the origin of that very discussion is going to pop its head into it at some point. And someone's gonna say, wait a second, this all goes back to this, and someone else might say, no, it all goes back to this other thing. But but you're all going to think it goes back to something, right? You're talking about something. It leads from something. That there's some starting point that you're going to have to posit, even just to make sense of what others are saying, whether in political communities, whether it's a revolutionary event that everybody has to refer back to, or a constitution, or a tradition of monarchy, whatever it might be. There's some origin that you're always going to talk about, even just who started it, right? Kids in a playground fighting about something. Who started it is the question that they're always going to find their way back to as well, because who started it gives you, in a sense, the essence of the event, right? And it's not always an easy question to answer, but it's kind of an impossible question to avoid. So. And I think ultimately, even in science, certain questions of origin. I mean, the universe must have an origin to it, and I don't know if that happened in some kind of gradual way either, right? That's why we had the Big Bang theory. Why do people assume that's where the universe must have come from?
Yeah, I wanted to say two things on that. One thing on just Aaron. One last thing on Aaron Hunter's essay. One thing that I noticed in all of his talk about science and philosophy of science, he neglects to bring up Paul Feyerabend. Because if I were critiquing anything on the basis that it's not falsifiable, I would be remiss if I did not bring up one of the enemy of science, the self-professed enemy of science, right? He does. This is a guy who defended astrology from this committee of committee of cosmologists and astronomers who were bashing it, and he was pointing out the same thing that astrology, these scientists were doing, was the same that Aaron Hunter was doing, which is they're not really these people aren't really bringing up what generative anthropology is or what astrology is. They're just saying what they're just criticizing it based on their prejudice and just saying, oh, based on my credentials and this list of what I consider to be scientific, this isn't scientific. But the Paul Feyerabend points out that this is just fallacious thinking. Honestly, it's basically a logical fallacy. It's based on your views on what if you're going to criticize an entire field, you should at least do the due diligence and know what you're criticizing, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a question of what you want to do, right? I mean, do you want to continue discussion? Do you want to enhance, discussion and conversation, or do you want to carry out what's essentially a police action, right?
Yeah,
To
yeah,
kind of prescribe a particular mode of thought and warn other people that if they engage in it, they're excluded from some kind of community, right? It hasn't received its certification, right? It's like asking for your papers in a sense. Um, yeah, I mean that's a good reference. Feyerabend is great, and and nobody quite knows what to do with him. And but that basic attitude that he had towards these kind of policing maneuvers within scientific disciplines um, and these reasons for deciding what's going to count as science, which is really a way of deciding what you can think and what you can't think, and the constant pressure he kept up on that um, was admirable and to be to be emulated, I think, because yeah, that's the only
yeah.
way that's the only way new thinking can emerge by not caring all that much about the certification procedures for entering a particular discipline that have kind of coagulated into a particular institution.
Yeah, the one thing you said about origins really struck me as origins being important. Um, uh, one of the argument that Thomas Aquinas makes for our the our with for sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. We've been going on for a little while, but
No, I'll get it back.
our origin the Thomas Aquinas does bring up the idea that humans are obsessed with origins in his work, and he uses that to argue for the centrality of God in ethics, because he says, look, human beings are obsessed with origins. It preoccupies so much of our discourse and how we look at things, and if you take these metaphysical beliefs like things like act and potency and theology and the natural theology and the five ways, you see that God is the ultimate origin of things, uh, and in that way, therefore, this is another way of saying that God is the center. It should is and should be the center of our discourse on ethics and the universe and all things. and this is one of the reasons why in medieval philosophy, uh, things there was this active sort of orientation around God being our first cause and our final end. And what separated the medievals from the moderns is this break in this obsession with origins, where the moderns decided that origins, ultimate origins, were not as important, and we were going to focus instead on the technical matters of here and now, and focus on manipulating nature for our own benefit. Um, and and it was and you see this shift in the writings of Sir Francis Bacon and Galileo and other founders of modern science.
Yes.
Well, I was going to say.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, no. I'd like to hear your thought.
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and I'll start at the end. That's true, but nevertheless, you could see that even the modern thinkers can't do without some kind of origin, right? I mean, these social contract theories, there, as you say, they're not really meant to be taken literally, but still, why do you need them in that case if you don't need origins at all? And every revolution, I mean, look at the French Revolution tried to kind of create a new calendar. Right. In other words, it tried to posit itself as a new origin. Right. So these are all kind of appropriating the origins that have always been assumed in human communities. And yes, in a sense, it all goes back to God, and God is the originary center. There's Gans at one point defines God as the only sign that where the signified is the referent, right? That's what
where the sign and meaning are one.
What?
I remember that line. It's where the sign and the meaning are one.
Yeah, that's a way of putting it, right? And the way I think about it is and I think that's a very kind of helpful way of thinking about it. That's the only sign where that's both referent and signified. I also think about it in terms of in a sense, you can't, whether or not God exists is kind of one kind of question, and in a certain sense, it's you can try and prove it logically, I suppose, philosophically. In the end, I don't think any of those. I mean, some will be more convincing than others, I suppose, but none of them will be kind of like immune to to various kinds of refutation, I think. But it's something else to ask whether the word God means something. And the interesting thing is that it becomes, I don't think it's possible to deny that the word God means something. Even the atheist thinks it means something, right? Because the atheist cares about it. The atheist wants to say it's a lie, or that God is fake, or that there's no such thing as God. But you can't even say that without acknowledging that there's a meaning to the word God. And if the word God means something, whether or not you think there's some entity that you could describe one way or another that's being referred to by the word, the very fact that the word means something is consequential. Because why then would we have this word that means something, whether or not, and that you can't stop it from meaning something? It's not like sort of unicorn or something like that, which doesn't exist, but kind of means something, like maybe in the context of fairy tales or something like that. You can you don't need the word unicorn, right? You can have a language without the word unicorn, but you can't really have a language without a word that's more or less God, one way or another. So why is that? And once you kind of focus in on that question, then the question of believing, and believing is kind of like one of these late words. that I'm kind of I tend to be critical about. It's I think the word the notion of belief kind of derives from oath, taking, where you have to affirm your faith in a particular institutional context, um, and that's to be sort of explicitly, in a sense, on the record as being responsible for what follows from asserting a certain belief, a certain claim, right? And then the notion of belief then kind of becomes this sort of more internalized thing along the way, and so I'm not so interested in belief, um, but uh, um, but in a sense, the effects um, of say the inescapability of some reference to a central being, it seems to me, is already implicit in in the fact that the word God sort of can't be excised from the language. It can't be its meaning can't be kind of eviscerated or evacuated or eliminated. You're in a sense, you're stuck with the word God, and why that is, and attempts to deny God or be against God or whatever, it's just kind of strengthen the meaning of God, and all that's gotta suggest something about human origins and the constitution of the human.
Definitely. It's kind of funny. I really wanted to. I would love to talk more and more about this. We could talk for hours about this. I mean, I had a whole lot of other. Um, I mean, I had another. I could go for another half an hour of questioning on the idea of your idea of sovereignties, which was one of your
Mm.
G blogs, and it's like, but do we have time to do that? I mean, it's past 11 and now.
We could talk a little bit longer, sure. We could talk some other time after this as well, if you like. But yeah, we
Yeah.
can talk a little bit longer if you want to ask about that in particular. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when you wrote your one of your latest GA blog posts on it was called Resistance Without Super Sovereignties.
Hmm.
And it reminded me of a current debate that was being had on post-liberal dissident right circles. So you have a certain faction of people, and most of them are going to be these nationalist types, more, um, and they are very much opposed to what they call medical tyranny, which is this imposition of these by imposition by liberal democracies of these policies like vaccine mandates, lockdowns, mask mandates, and so on. And they are very much opposed to that on the grounds that, oh, these are propagated by the same people who are propagating other harmful policies. These policies are trying to they're trying to make me do things to my body that I don't want to do. And, they're based on these lies and so on. And but then on the other side, you have these groups of post-liberals who are engaged in. I don't want to say this because it sounds bad, uh, but it can only be described as language policing, where they're going after these nationalist types and saying, "Oh, well, you're using words like freedom and tyranny and equality and things like that to rhetoric like my body, my choice," and that all presupposes liberalism. And you can't oppose this kind of liberal tyranny and then using the language of liberalism. And this drives the nationalist types up the wall because obviously, if they're trying to express their discontent, and then you have people who are ostensibly on the same side going out and saying, "Hey, you're doing it wrong," and nationalists, they're like, what are we supposed to do?" And I think your article really talks about a solution to that sort of problem. I'd like to hear your thoughts, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that debate that's going on online.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you might remember that. I remember that article, of course, but um, I think I wrote it around the time of the 2020 election, if I remember correctly, um, and a little before, a little after. I'm not sure. And I remember kind of the basic argument, but not all of it. Maybe you'll help me out here. But you gave a context, and I'll work with the context. And yeah, this is all very interesting, of course, and it's all very difficult. And in a sense, the politics of it seem to kind of track with the politics of you know of wokeness and questions of anti-racism and transgender politics and all of that, which were I mean, the people who were on one side in those earlier and obviously still ongoing conflicts are seem to be on the same side in this new conflict, which is itself interesting. At least in the U.S., that's the case. In other countries, it seems kind of more complicated. I'm not sure what's going on, across the world with this, but in the U.S., it seems to just map on existing left-right divisions, more or less that were pre-existing. Everyone just kind of filled their slot, and that was already there, which again is kind of interesting and worth noting. And even though this is it's kind of a different, it's a different issue, except insofar as you frame it in terms of globalism and new forms of global power, which I'm guessing is the way in which most nationalists would
Yes.
frame it, right? If you
Yeah,
think,
the conflict seems to be between within the nationalist camp in a lot of ways. It's between some people who are more influenced maybe by Imperium Press's work, who I called post-liberals, and then nationalists who reject liberalism, but they still make use of
Mhm.
certain terms that the post-liberals would say are inappropriate for a non-liberal to use.
Yeah, the whole word tyranny, right? I spent a bit of time talking about that in anthropomorphics, and it's kind of it's sort of a problematic word because I think it emerges essentially as just any ruler that's not ritually sanctioned, right? It's the breakdown of sacral kingship and divine kingship, right? These more forms of kingship, as all forms of kingship originally were, bound up in a ritual order, and were part of that ritual order. And you start to have what were called tyrants in ancient Greece, when you started to have rulers who ruled outside of that order, and therefore we're in a sense not legitimated by that order, and therefore they ruled by what would seem to be just force, right, coercion, and other buying off their enemies, and bribing allies, and all
Mm.
this kind of thing, right? All of these kind of non-sacred approaches to rule that of course became the norm for all rulers. So tyrant ultimately means some ruler who is outside of the order that's meant to sanctify that rule. But in a liberal democracy, what counts as being outside of the order that sanctifies this rule, becomes very sort of arbitrary and subjective, and you have endless arguments over this without really any way of settling it. Someone's acting outside of the Constitution. Well, I mean, what is the Constitution, right? The Constitution is a document that's interpreted in authoritative ways by certain bodies, right? By the courts, ultimately. And the courts are filled with people who have been educated to understand law and the Constitution in a certain way, in places called law schools. And so ultimately, someone's a tyrant because they're acting in such a way that the graduates of the best law schools can't abide. Is in a sense what it comes down to on one side, or on the other side, some other set of graduates, from either the best law schools or law schools that we prefer or whatever are, are the ones who wouldn't be able to kind of, sanctify the actions of a particular sovereign, right? And in a sense, it's arbitrary, but it's also, I mean, more importantly, it's kind of really useless because, okay, I mean, is Justin Trudeau now acting outside of the parameters of the Canadian constitutional order? Okay, I know very little about the Canadian constitutional order. I'm not even going to venture into that, but I would be willing to lay a bet on who's going to say yes and who's going to say no in that regard. And you could kind of play out the reasons that they're all going to have. No, and it's not a legitimate state of emergency because a state of emergency has to meet these criteria. And the other side will say, well, but does it have to meet all these criteria? And how do you know it doesn't meet this criteria? I think it does meet these criteria. If you interpret the conditions on the ground in this way, then it does meet this criteria. It is really a national security crisis if we interpret it this way, and if we point to things, to these things going on, and if we say there's foreign involvement and support and all these other things. I mean, you can play out all the arguments on all of these sides, and ultimately, it's really you're really just arguing for a particular articulation of institutions versus another articulation of institutions, but without ever really getting to the point of saying why organizing our legal, military, police, corporate, and all these other institutions in one way is better than doing it in some other ways, and better in what sense? I mean, again, if you're judging everything by some notion of legitimacy, which ultimately involves some notion of legality, then you can never really pose the question of how things should be ordered, why they're ordered as they are, and how they should be ordered, and so you really do get trapped. I'm not speaking about the specific positions that you're referring to, because I don't know them so well. I mean, I'm vaguely familiar with them, of course, but I don't want to get into them in too much detail, the nationalist versus post-liberal thing. But as long as your arguments are all about legitimacy, then they're really arguments about organizing institutions that can't be presented or aren't being presented as arguments about a particular institution. Well, how should courts be organized, right? How should we determine what counts as a transgression or a violation of the law, and what should we do with people who are found to be transgressing the law? How should we judge what people do and what the consequences of what people do? This is what institutions are for. And if you're going to think about a way of doing this, that so that you ultimately know that everyone is kind of doing what they purport to be doing, right? Whether it's preserving peace and order on the most abstract level, or managing specific institutions according to specific derived traditional affirmed criteria, then that serve certain social purposes. If ultimately you want to bring the discussion into channels like that, where we're really asking, what we're doing, why we think some things are good and some things are not good, what we take to be, acceptable, what we take to be beneficial, what we take to be virtuous, and how we organize things so as to enhance the things we consider good and virtuous and so on. If we want to channel our discussions in those directions, then it's best not to get trapped into these endless arguments about legitimacy, which again then ultimately come down to like this arguing, that this provision of the Constitution has been violated or has not been violated, and what does that provision of the Constitution actually mean, and so on. You might start there because it's a way of talking with people, but even if you start there, you want to you want to get somewhere else. Right? You don't want to think that answering that question is going to be answering a real question, even if that's where you have to start to get to where the real questions are. And so the idea of super sovereignties was and the power of the disciplines. There's kind of a linguistic grounding to that, which we probably shouldn't get into right now. But politically and ethically thinking, that's what I found to be important, in making that that argument, trying to understand what how these terms that we take to be kind of commonsensical terms regarding legitimacy and what's legal and what's constitutional and who's a tyrant and who's not a tyrant. They're all bound up in these institutions that ultimately are trying to make sense of power in a post-sacral world, and all they're doing so far, I think we do have to make sense of power in a post-sacral world ultimately, but all they're doing so far is kind of putting these very kind of feeble substitutes for sacrality in the place where sacrality used to be, and it doesn't work, and it just leads to again, it leads to arguments and contentions and to certain kinds of partisan politics that end up you build your side in a sense, and you can sustain things that way.
Kind of like, I mean, hearing all this reminds me of the situation that Alistair McIntyre describes in After Virtue, with all the different political sides just arguing past each other.
Mhm.
None of them have this common moral framework. And in fact, they can't build a common moral framework because, as McIntyre says, they've lost tradition, they've lost the notion of final causation and purpose. And it comes down to origin and purpose. First cause and final cause in Aristotelian terms.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, again, I'm not really, opposed to that. I'm trying to ground it in more in language, and
Mm.
um,
Yeah, I think that there's it's it, I think that the super sovereignty notion that you're talking about is basically um from a Thomist view, it sounds like you're describing this modern notion of human rights or equality or liberty and whatnot that is sort of a free floating signifier that is not grounded in any real community or any real institution. It's just supposedly in the air or something. It's like, and we don't want to ignore. And when it is explicitly justified, it's usually given as Chris Bond points out. It's usually given a sort of consequentialist argument. Well, we pretend like these things are sacred because it'll bring about world peace. Well, how can you justify that, right? It seems like a very um, big promise, but
right, and if
yeah,
this goes back to our discussion of individualism at the beginning, right? And yeah, all of these, and I think this is part of McIntyre's argument as well, that all these concepts, the individual, liberty, equality, and so on, they're all rights. They've all been kind of chipped out of a much larger kind of conceptual and institutional architecture that gave them very specific meaning within previous institutional orders, and once they've been kind of in a sense chipped out of and removed from that architecture, then they just get leveraged
mhm.
in various ways for for political purposes, and the political purposes really can't get much beyond um, making a claim for power. And the only claim you could make for power is something along the lines of what you just said, which is, I'm just going to make everything better in some way, or I'm going to be against everyone who's making things worse in some way that really can never be explained. But in the heat of the moment, it makes sense, right? Which is why the heat has to continually be turned up, right? There's got to be someone, again, there's got to be a usurper, there's got to be a tyrant right there on the horizon, right? And
Yeah,
we have to kind of suspend our deliberations, right? We have to stop Trump, right? We don't like Biden. Nobody likes Biden, right? But Trump's a fascist, and so we have to stop Trump right now, and we can't really think too much about.
you describe in that.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say that you say in the super sovereignty essay that you talk about this. You use the language of it's an imperative gap between the occupied center and the signifying center.
Right.
And I think that basically sums it up. Like you say, oh, it's this. So you have the center of the Constitution, and we are trying to glean meaning from that. And rather than, as you say, as you suggest in the article, trying to close that gap, there are groups that try to widen that gap to benefit themselves.
Right, and it strikes me a good way to think about that is actually by reference to to Saul Alinsky and one of his rules for radicals. Right, everybody knows about Alinsky at this point, even though people kind of seem to have stopped talking about it in the last couple of years. But one of his rules is always make the authorities live up to their own rules, um, and in a certain sense. That's a good rule to follow. The authorities are they lay down certain rules, they order certain things, and you want to know what they're ordering. If you're gonna obey the orders, then you want to know what they are. Now, Alinsky wants to do that for the reason that you just gave, right? He wants to exacerbate the imperative gap. For him, that's a way of showing that the rules can't really apply. And by showing that the rules can't really apply, you continually delegitimate those who rely upon the rules for their legitimacy. So that's his purpose. And now, but if we want the rules to genuinely apply, we might actually find out. And this is kind of what I was getting at in that article, the resistance without supersovereignty. We might very well find out that the rules don't apply and can't be applied in any consistent way. And so you have all the conditions that you could call a tyranny, but it's pointless to call it a tyranny. And so what you do, you kind of all you can do is say something like, I don't know how to follow the orders. I don't know how to do what you're asking me to do. I don't know what you're asking me to do. And this seems like a very kind of passive approach in a sense, but if you're kind of itemizing in a sense and exposing everything that makes it impossible for you to follow the imperatives that are coming from the center, what you're in fact doing is opening things up for someone in the center, whether it's the one who's there right now, and you can never exclude the possibility that a current ruler will turn himself around and become a better ruler than he is, and you should never explicitly exclude that possibility, even if you hate the guy. But otherwise, you're essentially you're laying the groundwork for someone who will lay down rules that can in fact be followed, and that in following them make the rules more clear, enrich the rules with further, implications and corollaries that enable you to follow the rules more effectively and in such a way as to give yourself more, responsibility, and to give others more responsibility, and to enhance cooperation within the system. Right? These are the things that ultimately we want. Right? Rules that that can be followed, because in following them, you become the kind of person who's also able to explain them and add to them and strengthen them and teach others how to follow them and so on. And it seems to me that's really the kind of social order that we want, where the things that we're doing, the practices that we're engaged in, we can all see them as becoming increasingly coherent, and becoming increasingly self-aware within within an order that kind of ties things together, right? And that keeps giving us orders that kind of follow up and increase this cooperation and coherence and so on. And so you want to make yourself, in a sense, the kind of you want to make the kind of person who can participate in that order, and so in a sense you present yourself as someone anticipating that, you might say. So So that's kind of, in a sense, Alinsky's rule, but properly followed, not in a not in a kind of subversive and sarcastic um, and kind of deliberately
Bad
disruptive
faith.
way, but in such a way as to give us rules that and more specifically orders, imperatives that we can live with properly and
Mhm.
fully in a way that makes us um, you know uh, more um, more
Human?
responsible well, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to suggest human, but responsible is good too.
Yeah,
I
okay.
was just
Human.
yeah, and that sort of gets into the civilizational ethics that I talked about in a live stream, and I found really good because it really because when you because in your work you pit again the victimary thinking against originary thinking, and say that the victimary theory thinking in liberalism and leftism sort of has this resentment that the resentment that existed on the originary scene taken forward in time, sort of, and the counter to that, originary thinking, is just like you said, rather than broadening that imperative gap and trying to use it to use to satisfy your resentment, trying to take what you feel is yours, you would instead try to enhance the civilization. Or in Thomistic terms, you would try to contribute to the common good, which is a good that's shared by all without being diminished in itself. Something like language would be a common good,
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
and
And the sense
the
being more, go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah, and what do you would I think, and I again, we can talk about this all day, but I wanted to ask one last question, which is I can see somebody from the nationalist camp, and this has been brought up before by people within. I think it might have been brought up before to Mike or Joel Davis, and it was this question of, well, what if the imperative is something like, if you're a white man, you should just kill yourself, or it's something very clear, but clearly antagonistic to your self-interest, like your existence. Like it's saying, kill yourself if you're a straight white man, or something like that. It's very. I mean, it would satisfy the. It would be very clear if they did it like that, and so, some of the propaganda does seem to be leaning that way. Certainly there are a lot of academics who express something like this even if they deny it after the fact.
Mhm.
um so what if the imperative is something like that?
Yeah, well, this is a point where you'd have to posit, a kind of imperative gap between what the explicit order is and what's a possible and what's a possible order within within any really possible sociality, right? And in a certain sense, um, uh, the this um, this concept that I that I also worked with in anthropomorphics, I think is maybe useful to think about, say, that kind of hypothetical imperative, and as you say, the those that you could see as kind of leaning in that direction, even if they're not quite that explicit. And that's this notion of originary satire. And I do think, and in fact, I was, part of the way in which I devised or designed that concept was by watching the the alt right, what was then called the alt right, on in various on online and elsewhere, which and it seemed to be more than anything else to be an essentially satirical movement. and in a way a very effective one. It was ridiculing, it was mocking, and a lot of what it was doing was, in a sense, a Linsky style type of taking these imperatives being issued by the central order literally, and seeing what they look like. And I think, in a sense, if if the imperatives are being such as the ones that you're referring to are being given, and there's not another power that is countering them, then in a sense I think you would be. Now, if you think you have the organization of a counterpower that would represent the real center, and you could, and you can combat that, then you could point to another imperative that you're following, right? And then, it's a question of that, of that imperative being one that again, that makes kind of human participation in the social order possible in a way that this doesn't. And in a sense, you can always, in a sense, go over to that side if you have such a power. If you don't, then and then we're talking about a very severe power imbalance, right? A real asymmetry. And I think, in a sense, that the best that you can do, and I think it would, it might lead in various directions, is to in a sense kind of turn around and say, okay, give me more details. Lay this out for me. How exactly should I do this? What within the institutional order, we'll do it. What's the, do I go to the National Health Service and ask them to apply, some lethal drug or something like that? I mean, just make it more and more explicit that this is what's being demanded, and make it more and more unmistakable that this is what's being demanded. In a certain sense, you're not really disobeying. That really follows what I was talking about before, which is, I just want to clarify these imperatives. And the thing is, if in the process of clarifying certain imperatives, you expose those imperatives as really impossible to carry out by the people who would need to carry them out, then in a certain sense you're invalidating them. You're showing them that they're inoperative as imperatives, and in a sense that might be more demanding than to say, I just refuse to do this. But if you refuse to, if it's a real imperative, and they really have the power to to compel your obedience to this imperative, then saying that you oppose it isn't going to make any difference either, right? So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, you could say I'm against it, and you can try and put together the physical means to try and resist. And if you could put together the physical means that to try and resist, and you could do that effectively, then in a sense we're working with a divided social order without a clear imperative, without a clear imperative center, and then things are being contested, and it becomes a question of, like, in a sense, the way in which liberal democracy is essentially divided up into two opposing armies who just vote instead of fighting. Well, that can always turn into fighting, and if you think that is the path to avoiding that kind of imperative, then you could try that, and if you do that successfully, then it'll turn out that that was the actual social order all along, and you're just kind of in a sense revealing it and allowing it to operate. If you don't have something like that, then I think the other path, and I think the one that is likely to be one that could be followed, and likely to be more effective under under contemporary conditions, is the one that I'm suggesting, which is again, originary satire, which is, okay, you're telling me to do this, and like I said, I'm not making this up. This was based on my observations of how the alt-right was kind of forming itself in the first place. Okay, you're telling me to do this. This is your imperative. This is I just want to know. Okay, so what exactly should I do? And what should everybody else be doing? Well, I'm doing what you say I should be doing. Okay, okay, even, if the imperative is, that I have to commit suicide. I mean, it's hard to imagine it getting to the point where the imperative would be, you have to commit suicide. But at the very least, it would, it might be you have to, submit yourself to someone who will whatever incarcerate you or do whatever. But then at that point, okay, so so how do I do that, and how is everybody else supposed to do that, and what are the orders being given across the board, right? And in a way to just keep exposing the social order that's commanding this, and in exposing it again, in a sense, a bad order is one that gets weaker the more it's exposed. Okay, and the more the infrastructure enabling it is exposed. A good order is one that becomes more effective the more you understand, how its institutional infrastructure, and how it's kind of how this particular order operates in such a way as to make all kinds of other imperatives operative, and so on, right? In a kind of coherent larger order, then exposing how the order works is better. If someone's asking you to do something that's beneficial for the institution that you're working in, and you ask, well, can you explain why you're asking me to do this? If they have a good reason for asking you to do it, then they will be able to explain, right? And they'll be able to explain in a way that's satisfying to you and it's satisfying to others, right? But if you're giving someone an order that can't really be justified, that's a bad order, that's one that will lead to more dysfunction, more violence, more destruction, then asking to have that order explained and placed in the context of a particular tradition, and placed in the context of a kind of authoritative institutional order and so on, that in effect is resistance, right? Because it can't be done, because the things can't be thought about too much on the part of other people following out the orders. So that would be my response to that kind of question or critique.
Thank you. That was very certainly a. I've said similar things on my channel about orders, but I think you laid it out much more clearly than I've ever done. I think a lot of these orders, like you should kill yourself if you're a straight white male. Usually it's implicit, and it's more effective since it's implicit in things like media, pop culture media, and within the confine. And it only becomes explicit when you see these black academics ranting in front of a sympathetic audience, and then later they get exposed in the public, and then they're like, "Oh, I don't mean this literally. I just mean I'm just expressing myself, or I'm just expressing the resentment of the black population that feels oppressed," or
Right,
something
because
like
it would
that.
in fact be very difficult to formulate actual imperatives along these lines within an institutional framework. And even if you could, you know, well, as a straight white man, I should, whatever, I should kill myself and so on. Well, at that point, if there was really an order like that, well, I mean, what are your criteria for whiteness exactly? Define whiteness. If it was going to apply to me, maybe there are terms on which I don't fit your definition of whiteness. Okay, maybe I'm something else that doesn't quite fit this category, right? In other words, if you're going to define, if you're going to say white people should be subjected to this or that, or should do this or that, well, then again, the onus gets put back on you. Well, what exactly do you mean? I thought whiteness didn't mean anything in the first place. I thought it wasn't real. I thought it was just kind of a state of mind or a privilege that people assume or whatever. Well, I mean, if you're telling me I should do this, it's certainly not a privilege anymore. So what is it exactly? Right? I mean, so again, all of this falls under the category of just exposing, the limits, the inoperativity of any imperative along those lines, which, as you say, is why it can only be advanced in these kind of sneaky, indirect, and again, only occasionally like hysterically explicit ways.
Gotcha. Hey, thank you for coming on, and that's a really good place to end here. But before we go, I'd like to say to my audience, if you haven't read Adam's books, I highly recommend getting them. I do have them. I do have it on my shelf, but unfortunately, I have this nasty habit of sundoku, which, in case you don't know, it's the habit of it's a Japanese term for the habit of piling on books that you say you're going to read, but you haven't yet gotten to them because there are just so many.
Yeah,
But I have
yeah.
I have been binge reading your blogs and stuff, so that's almost a close second to reading your book. I there are so many other topics we could discuss at a later date, like metaphysics and other things like that. But the topics that you covered today were very informative, and I'm sure this is going to contribute to the wider discourse as contribute to the wider discourse. So, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to say before we wrap up things up?
Well, no, I'll just say thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I enjoyed it too. Well, everybody, this is William of Applied Virtue, and I'm signing off. Goodbye.